The Woman Who Wouldn't Run. The woman stepped off the stage into Copper Creek wearing widow's black and carrying secrets that could burn the whole valley down. They thought she was just another mail-order mistake sent to tame Garrett Cole's wild ranch, the kind that'd last a week before running back east. But when she walked past the leering banker and his hired guns without flinching, past the whispering townswomen without begging, something shifted in the dust. She wasn't running to Copper Creek. She was running from something worse, and Copper Creek, in all its arrogance, had just become her last stand. Welcome to a story of fire, lies, and the kind of courage that doesn't ask permission. Stay until the end to see how a wanted woman became a legend. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The October wind carried the smell of coming snow and the weight of broken promises. Evelyn Hart, if that was even her real name, stood on the warped boards of Copper Creek's excuse for a depot and let the stage driver drop her single battered suitcase at her feet like he couldn't wait to be rid of it. Her carpet bag stayed clutched against her ribs, one gloved hand pressed to it like it held her last breath. The town watched. It always watched when a new woman came through. Copper Creek survived on gossip the way it survived on whiskey. Bitter, plentiful, and passed around until everyone was drunk on it. And a woman traveling alone, dressed in black that was too fine for mourning and too worn for money, arriving at the Cole Ranch by arrangement? That was the kind of gossip that could feed the valley through winter. Martha Gibbs, standing outside the mercantile with her arms crossed under her considerable bosom, leaned toward her daughter. That's the fourth one this year. Garrett Cole's got about as much luck with women as he does with cattle prices. She won't last the week, her daughter predicted, smoothing her apron with the satisfaction of someone who'd already written the ending. That ranch is cursed. Everyone knows it. Evelyn heard them. Her hearing had been sharpened by 3 years of running, 3 years of sleeping light and listening for footsteps that meant the end. She heard everything. The banker watching from his office window, the sheriff's deputy lounging against the jailhouse with his hand too close to his gun, the whispers that followed her like flies on meat. She didn't react. Instead, she turned her attention to the wagon rolling toward her through the rutted street. It was held together by rust and stubbornness, pulled by 2 horses that looked like they'd given up on pride about the same time their owner had. The man driving barely glanced at her as he pulled the team to a stop. Garrett Cole looked exactly like a man who'd been losing for too long. He was maybe 35, though the lines around his eyes and the gray threading his dark hair suggested he'd lived harder than that. His clothes were clean but patched, his hat battered, his hands scarred from work that never ended and never paid enough. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome before grief and debt had carved it down to something harder. He didn't smile. "You're the housekeeper." It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, empty of welcome or warmth. "I'm Evelyn Hart." She met his eyes without flinching, without the nervous flutter other women might have shown. "And yes, if you're Garrett Cole." "I am." He climbed down, took her suitcase without asking, and threw it in the wagon bed with less care than he'd probably show a feed sack. His gaze flicked to the carpet bag still pressed against her side. "That too?" "No." The word came quick and firm. "This stays with me." Something shifted in his expression. Not curiosity exactly, but the kind of weary recognition one broken thing shows another. He didn't push, just nodded toward the wagon bench. "It's an hour to the ranch. Longer if the creek's up." Evelyn climbed onto the seat, settling her skirts with the kind of practiced dignity that came from years of pretending everything was fine while the world burned around her. The carpet bag stayed in her lap, her hands folded over it like a shield. Garrett clicked to the horses and they lurched forward. The town watched them leave, already placing bets on how long she'd last. The Cole Ranch sat in a valley that should have been beautiful. Rolling grassland backed by mountains that turned purple at sunset, a creek that ran clear and cold, enough timber in the high country to build a legacy. Should have been. Instead, it looked like something slowly giving up. The house was a 2-story structure that had probably been proud once, back when Garrett's father first claimed this land and thought he was building an empire. Now it sagged like an old man's shoulders, the paint long since weathered to gray, shutters hanging crooked and one corner of the porch visibly rotting. The barn wasn't much better, functional but desperate, held together by hope and wire. Evelyn took it all in with the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with survival. She'd learned to read places the way some people read books, looking for the truth beneath the surface. What she saw was debt, desperation, and the kind of pride that wouldn't ask for help even while drowning. "Kids are inside," Garrett said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. He didn't look at her. "Wade's 14, Lila's 10, Ben just turned 6. They know you're coming. Don't expect miracles." He climbed down and grabbed her suitcase, carrying it toward the house like he was hauling stones. Evelyn followed, her boots crunching on ground that was more dust than grass, her carpetbag still clutched tight. The door opened before they reached it. The boy standing in the frame was all angles and suspicion, tall for 14, built lean and hard from work, with his father's dark hair and eyes that had learned not to trust. Wade Cole looked at Evelyn like she was a rattlesnake that had wandered onto the porch, something to be watched until it either left or showed its fangs. "She's here," he called back into the house, his tone suggesting this was not good news. "I can see that," a girl's voice, sharp with the kind of bitterness that sits wrong on a 10-year-old. Garrett pushed past his son without ceremony, dropping Evelyn's suitcase in the front hall. "Wade, Lila, Ben, this is Miss Hart. She's here to keep house and help with the cooking. You'll treat her with respect." The words sounded like something he'd practiced, empty of conviction. Wade's expression said exactly what he thought of that. Lila appeared behind him, a skinny girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She looked Evelyn up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. "The last one lasted 3 days," Lila said flatly. "Before that, Mrs. Henderson made it almost a week. You won't do better." "Lila," Garrett's voice carried a warning. "It's true." The girl crossed her arms. "You can't just keep buying housekeepers like you buy seed. It doesn't work." Evelyn watched this exchange in silence, her expression revealing nothing. She'd faced worse than hostile children. She'd faced men with guns and badges and the kind of cold calculation that turned people into problems to be solved. 3 angry, grieving children were painful, but they weren't dangerous. Not the way the man who'd sent her running was dangerous. "Where should I put my things?" she asked Garrett, her voice calm and level. He gestured vaguely toward the stairs. "Room at the end of the hall. Door sticks. Roof leaks when it rains hard, so move the bed away from the north wall." He was already turning away, clearly done with the whole business of her arrival. "Supper's at 6. Kids know their chores." Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him as he headed back toward the barn. Evelyn stood in the dim hallway, surrounded by children who wanted her gone, and a house that smelled of dust and old grief. The carpetbag felt heavier in her arms, weighted with everything she'd left behind and everything she couldn't afford to lose. Wade broke the silence first. "You should leave now. Save yourself the trouble." "Yeah," Lila agreed. "This place isn't for people like you." "People like me." Evelyn repeated the words softly, tasting them. Then she looked at Wade with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by a 14-year-old's posturing. "What kind of people do you think I am?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "The kind that runs. The kind that doesn't last." "Interesting." Evelyn set her carpetbag down carefully, then picked up her suitcase. "I suppose we'll see." She walked past them toward the stairs, her spine straight and her footsteps deliberate. Behind her, she heard the youngest, Ben, whisper something she couldn't quite catch, and Lila's sharp response telling him to hush. The room at the end of the hall was exactly what she'd expected. Small, spare, with a narrow bed and a dresser missing 2 handles. The window looked out over the valley, offering a view that might have been peaceful if everything hadn't felt so desperate. There was a water stain on the ceiling in the exact spot Garrett had warned about, and the door did indeed stick, requiring a sharp pull to close. Evelyn set her suitcase on the bed but kept the carpetbag in her hands. She moved to the window, looking out at the dying afternoon light, at the mountains that ringed this valley like walls. She'd been sent here to disappear, to be forgotten, to fade into the kind of obscurity that came from being just another housekeeper in just another failing ranch in just another nameless corner of the territories. The people who wanted her dead thought Copper Creek would swallow her without a trace. They were probably right. But Evelyn Hart, or whatever her real name was, had learned something in 3 years of running. Sometimes the best place to hide was in plain sight, and sometimes the only way to survive was to become someone else entirely. She pressed her hand to the carpet bag, feeling the weight of papers and proof and the truth that could burn more than just her life to ashes. Then she turned from the window and started unpacking. The kitchen was a disaster. Evelyn stood in the doorway as the sun set, taking inventory with the kind of cold assessment that came from knowing she'd either master this place or be destroyed by it. There was no middle ground. Not anymore. Dishes were piled in a bucket that served as a sink, the water long since gone cold and greasy. The stove was caked with spills that had burned and reburned until they were practically part of the iron. The table was scarred and sticky, scattered with the remnants of what she assumed had been breakfast, or possibly several breakfasts, given the archaeological layers. The pantry, when she investigated, was worse. Flour crawling with weevils, beans that looked older than Ben, a slab of salt pork that had seen better days, some wrinkled potatoes, coffee that was probably worth its weight in gold out here, and little else. It was, quite possibly, the saddest kitchen she'd ever seen. "We had a housekeeper last month," a small voice said from behind her. Evelyn turned to find the youngest cold child standing in the doorway, watching her with eyes that were too solemn for 6 years old. Ben was small for his age, all knees and elbows, with hair that stuck up in the back and dirt on his face that suggested no one had checked if he'd washed in recent memory. "Did you?" Evelyn said neutrally. Ben nodded. "She cried a lot. Then she left." "I see." "Are you going to cry?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "I don't think so. Crying doesn't make dishes clean themselves." This seemed to confuse him. He scuffed his bare foot against the floor, leaving a streak in the dust. "Wade says you'll leave like all the others. He says Pa can't keep a woman no matter how much he pays. Your brother has strong opinions. Lila does too. She says we don't need anybody. She says we were doing fine before." Evelyn looked around the kitchen, at the filth and disorder and slow decay, and wondered what this child's definition of fine included. But she didn't say that. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down, bringing herself to his eye level. "What do you think, Ben?" No one had asked him that in a long time. She could see it in the way he startled, in the quick flicker of hope before he remembered to hide it. "I don't know." "That's honest." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. "Would you like to know what I think?" A cautious nod. "I think this kitchen needs cleaning. I think supper needs cooking. And I think you might know where your father keeps the soap." Ben stared at her for a long moment, processing this. Then, slowly, he pointed toward a cabinet under the counter. "There. But it's almost gone." "Then we'll use what's left." Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirts. "Can you carry water?" Another nod, more certain this time. "Good. I'll need 2 buckets. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am." He scurried off with the kind of energy children have when given a task that feels important. Evelyn watched him go, then turned back to the kitchen and rolled up her sleeves. She'd faced worse than this. She'd faced courtrooms and conspiracies and a senator's assassin. She could face dirty dishes. By the time Garrett and the older children came in for supper, the kitchen had been transformed. It wasn't perfect. 3 hours and 1 small helper couldn't undo months of neglect. But it was functional. The dishes were clean and stacked. The table was scrubbed. The stove had been wrestled into submission and now radiated heat that actually felt welcoming. And something was cooking that smelled like food rather than desperation. Garrett stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Wade and Lila crowded behind him, their earlier hostility giving way to something more complicated. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion that this was a trick that would reveal itself soon enough. "Sit," Evelyn said without turning from the stove. "Supper's ready." It wasn't a request. Garrett hesitated, clearly unused to being ordered around in his own house, but something in her tone suggested arguing would be pointless. He moved to the table, taking the chair at the head out of habit. Wade and Lila followed, sitting in their usual spots with the wariness of animals approaching an unfamiliar situation. Ben was already there, practically vibrating with pride. "I helped," he announced. "I carried 4 buckets." "You did," Evelyn confirmed. She set a pot on the table. Nothing fancy, just beans and salt pork cooked with onions, and the last of some dried herbs she'd found. But it was hot, and it smelled edible, and that was more than this family had been managing on their own. She added a plate of cornbread that was only slightly burned on the bottom. Then she took the remaining chair, folded her hands, and waited. Garrett stared at the food like it might be a trap. "You didn't have to—" "I did," Evelyn interrupted quietly. "It's what you hired me for. You're supposed to start tomorrow. I'm here now." The kitchen was available. It seemed inefficient to wait. Wade reached for the cornbread, hesitated, then looked at his father for permission. Garrett nodded slowly, still watching Evelyn with that same unreadable expression. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons and Ben's occasional commentary about how he'd helped with the water. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't the hostile standoff from earlier either. It was something in between, a fragile truce built on hot food and clean dishes. Halfway through the meal, Lila spoke up. "The last housekeeper tried to make us pray before eating. Every meal. Long prayers." "Did she?" Evelyn's tone was neutral. "We didn't like it." "I imagine not." "Are you going to do that?" Evelyn set down her spoon and looked at the girl directly. "No, what you do or don't do with prayer is between you and whatever you believe. I'm here to keep house, not convert you." Something shifted in Lila's expression. Not quite approval, but maybe the first crack in her armor. Wade wasn't ready to surrender yet. "Mrs. Henderson tried to change everything. Said we were living like animals, said we needed civilizing. And what did your father say to that?" "He let her talk until she ran out of words. Then he asked if she was done insulting his dead wife's house." A ghost of something passed over Garrett's face. Grief, anger, both. But he kept eating without comment. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I'm not here to replace anyone or change what doesn't need changing. I'm here to cook and clean and keep things running. That's all." "That's what they all say," Lila muttered. "Then judge me by what I do, not what I say." The meal continued in that same uneasy silence until the food was gone and the light outside had faded to full dark. Garrett pushed back from the table first, the chair scraping loud in the quiet. "Kids, get to bed. You've got school in the morning." "I'm not going," Wade said immediately. "You're going. Someone needs to help with the fences in the north pasture." "I'll manage," Garrett's voice hardened. "You're going to school, all of you. That's not a discussion." Wade's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to push. He stood, shooting one last suspicious glance at Evelyn, then headed for the stairs. Lila followed, dragging Ben with her. When they were gone, Garrett turned to Evelyn. "They're not usually this—" "Yes, they are," Evelyn said calmly. "They're grieving and angry, and they've learned that people leave. Of course they're hostile." He blinked, clearly not expecting her to be that direct. "You don't have to stay. If it's too much, Mr. Cole." She stood, gathering dishes with efficient movements. "I've been here 4 hours. I've cleaned your kitchen, cooked 1 meal, and been glared at by your children. None of that is too much. If I were going to run, I'd have done it when I saw the state of the pantry." Despite himself, the corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. "It's that bad?" "It's worse, but it's fixable." She paused, dishes in hand. "Most things are, with enough work." Garrett studied her in the lamplight. This woman in her worn black dress, with her calm eyes, and her secrets pressed close, and something in his expression suggested he wanted to ask the questions he was too tired or too polite to voice. "Who are you really? Why are you here? What are you running from?" But he didn't. Instead, he just nodded. "Well, thank you for supper." "You're welcome." He left her there with the dishes and the dying fire, heading out into the dark toward the barn where he apparently slept these days, giving his children the house and himself the solitude of failure. Evelyn washed the dishes alone, listening to the old house settle around her, to the wind picking up outside, to the distant sound of cattle, and the closer sound of her own breathing. She was here. She'd survived the first day. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She knew that the way she knew her own name, both the false one and the real one she'd left behind. But tonight, In this broken house with this broken family, she'd managed something she hadn't managed in 3 years of running. She'd stayed. The trouble started at dawn. Evelyn woke to the sound of shouting and was dressed and downstairs before she'd fully registered the words. The kitchen was still dark, the stove cold, but the door to the yard was open and Garrett's voice was cutting through the morning like a blade. Told you to check that fence line. I did check it, Wade's voice, defensive and angry. It was fine yesterday. Well, it's not fine now. Half the herd scattered into Thompson's range, and if we don't get them back before he sees them, he'll claim them for damages. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene. Garrett was already in his coat, hat pulled low, face tight with the kind of stress that came from knowing one more disaster might be the last one. Wade stood in the yard in his undershirt and trousers, no coat, boots not even laced, looking young and scared and trying desperately not to show it. What happened? Evelyn asked. Fence is down. Cattle are out. Garrett swung into his saddle. I'll be back when I'm back. Wade, get dressed and ride to town. Tell the sheriff we've got strays to collect before Thompson starts making noise. I'll come with you. You'll do what I told you. Garrett wheeled his horse. And get your sisters to school. He was gone before Wade could argue, disappearing into the gray light at a gallop that suggested he was racing against more than just wandering cattle. Wade stood there shaking, from cold or rage or shame. Evelyn couldn't tell. Maybe all three. Get inside, she said quietly. You'll catch your death. I don't need... Inside. Now. Something in her voice made him move. He slouched past her into the kitchen, arms crossed over his thin chest, jaw locked against whatever he was feeling. Evelyn closed the door and went to the stove, building the fire with quick, efficient movements. When did you last check that fence line? 2 days ago. It was fine. Could someone have cut it? Wade's head snapped up. Why would someone... Then he stopped, understanding flooding his face. You think someone did this on purpose? I think your father is drowning in debt, and cattle wandering onto a neighbor's land is a convenient excuse for that neighbor to claim damages or force a sale. Evelyn set the coffee on to boil. So yes, I think it's possible someone helped those cows find their way through that fence. The boy stared at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. You've been here one day. How do you... I can read a situation, Wade. It's a useful skill. She pulled out the flour, checking it for weevils by habit. Now, are you going to town like your father asked? Or are you going to sit here and brood? He swallowed hard. I should have checked the fence yesterday. This is my fault. Maybe. Or maybe someone was counting on you not checking every day because you're 14 and you can't be everywhere at once. Evelyn started measuring flour for breakfast. Either way, sitting here bleeding guilt all over my clean floor isn't going to get those cattle back. Despite himself, Wade almost smiled. Almost. You're not like the others. No, I'm not. Why are you really here? It was the question she'd been expecting, delivered with a directness that would have done his father proud. Evelyn considered several answers, deflections, half-truths, the kind of polished lies she'd gotten good at telling. Instead, she said, because I needed somewhere to disappear, and your father needed help. Sometimes desperation makes for good partnerships. Wade studied her with eyes that were too old for his face. Are you in trouble? Everyone's in some kind of trouble. The question is whether you run from it or stand your ground. She met his gaze steadily. Now, get dressed, get to town, and tell the sheriff what your father said. Then come back here. I'll need help with something. What? I'll tell you when you get back. Go. He went, still suspicious, but at least moving. Evelyn heard him thundering up the stairs, heard Lila's sleepy complaint and his sharp response, heard the ordinary chaos of a family waking to another day of just barely surviving. She went back to making biscuits, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind worked through less familiar problems. She'd seen this kind of situation before. Not with cattle and fences, but with money and pressure and powerful people who knew how to squeeze until something broke. The details were different, but the pattern was the same. Someone wanted the coal ranch. someone with enough patience to bleed them slowly rather than just making an offer. Someone who understood that a man with 3 kids and a mountain of debt would eventually have to sell, especially if enough accidents kept happening. The question was who, and how much time they had. Evelyn pulled the biscuits from the oven just as Lila appeared in the doorway, Ben trailing behind her. The girl was dressed, but barely, her hair uncombed, her expression already defensive. "Wade says we have to go to school." "You do?" "I could stay and help." "You could, but you won't." Evelyn set plates on the table. "Sit, eat, then get your brother cleaned up and walk to school like your father told you." "You can't tell me." "I can. I am." Evelyn turned to face her fully. "Your father is out chasing cattle someone probably let loose on purpose. Your brother is riding to town to report it, and you are going to school because that's one thing that can still be normal in a day that's already gone sideways. Sit." Lila sat. So did Ben, his eyes wide. They ate in tense silence until Lila couldn't stand it anymore. "What do you mean someone let them loose on purpose?" "I mean exactly that. Your father has enemies, people who want this ranch, and cutting fences is cheaper than hiring lawyers." "That's—" Lila stopped, her face going pale. "Mr. Hale." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone in still water. "Who's Mr. Hale?" Evelyn asked carefully. "The banker. He came here last month, told Pa he needed to pay or he'd foreclose. Pa said he needed more time, and Mr. Hale said time wasn't free." Lila's hands had clenched around her fork. "Pa was real quiet after he left. Scary quiet." Evelyn filed this information away with the rest of the pieces starting to form a picture she didn't like. "Did this Mr. Hale say anything else?" "Just that he'd hate to see the ranch go to auction, that there were buyers who'd give a fair price if Pa wanted to sell direct." Ben piped up, his voice small. He had mean eyes. Out of the mouths of children. Evelyn had learned to trust that kind of instinct. Children often saw clearly what adults learned to overlook. "All right, finish eating, then school." "But school, Lila." "Your father needs you to do this one thing right today. Can you do that?" The girl's expression wavered between resentment and something that might have been relief. Relief that someone was treating this like a normal day, that not everything had to be a crisis. She nodded slowly. They finished breakfast in silence. Evelyn packed them lunch from the meager pantry. More of the biscuits, some of the salt pork, apples that were mostly good, and watched them head down the road toward town, Ben holding Lila's hand, both of them small figures against the big empty valley. Then she turned back to the house and started planning. She'd survived 3 years by staying ahead of the people hunting her, by seeing patterns before they closed into traps, by understanding that sometimes the best defense was knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. If Preston Hale wanted this ranch, she'd need to understand why. What made this particular piece of failing rangeland worth the effort of slowly destroying a family? And she'd need to do it before Garrett Cole's pride and debt and grief finally pulled him under. Evelyn went to her room and pulled out the carpet bag. Inside, beneath the careful layers of ordinary belongings, were the tools of her former life. Legal documents, correspondence, proof of things that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. She thought she was done with that life, done with fighting battles that couldn't be won, with standing against forces too big to stop. But maybe you never really left that kind of fight. Maybe it just followed you until you turned around and faced it. She pulled out a notebook and a pencil and started making lists. What she knew, what she needed to know, and what it would cost to find out. The woman who'd stepped off that stage yesterday had been Evelyn Hart, running and hiding and hoping to disappear. The woman sitting in this room now was starting to remember who she'd been before that, before the running, before the fear, before they'd made her into someone who had nothing left to lose. Outside, the morning sun was burning off the mist, revealing the valley in all its desperate beauty. Somewhere out there, Garrett was chasing scattered cattle. Wade was riding to town, and Preston Hale was probably sitting in his office, adding up numbers and planning his next move. None of them knew that the game had just changed, that Copper Creek's newest housekeeper wasn't just another woman waiting to run. Evelyn Hart closed the notebook and stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that had stopped shaking years ago. She had work to do, a pantry to inventory, a house to master, information to gather, and a banker to investigate. The Cole family thought they were alone in this fight. They were about to learn otherwise. Wade returned from town just before noon, his horse lathered and his face tight with information he clearly didn't want to deliver. Evelyn was in the yard when he rode up, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a bucket of soapy water at her feet, and murder in her eyes. She'd found the rattlesnake in the flower bin 20 minutes earlier. It had been coiled in the back corner, half buried in the weevil-infested flower, waiting with the patience that only predators and certain kinds of men possessed. Most women would have screamed, some would have run. Evelyn had grabbed the nearest cast-iron skillet, killed the snake with 3 deliberate strikes that left dents in the pan, then dragged the whole contaminated mess outside to burn. She was still burning it when Wade dismounted. "What happened?" he asked, staring at the smoking pile. "Rattlesnake, in the flower." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, her voice absolutely calm. "About 4 feet long. Probably came in through the loose board by the back door." Wade's face went pale. "You could have been bit, but I wasn't." She picked up the dented skillet, examining it with the same clinical detachment she'd shown the snake. "This will need reseasoning. What did the sheriff say?" The boy blinked at the abrupt change of subject, still processing the image of this proper-looking woman beating a rattlesnake to death with cookware. He said he'd send word to Thompson, but he also said— Wade stopped, his jaw working. "Said what?" "Said maybe Pa should consider Mr. Hale's offer, that holding on to the ranch was just prolonging the inevitable." The words came out bitter. "He's supposed to be the law, but he talks like he works for the bank." "Perhaps he does." Evelyn set the skillet down. "Did you see your father?" "Passed him on the road. He got most of the cattle back, but Thompson's already claiming 3 head for damages. Says they trampled his south fence and spooked his horses." Wade kicked at the dirt. "It's a lie. Thompson's fence was already falling down. Everyone knows it. Knowing and proving are different things. Feels like the whole valley's just waiting for us to fail." Evelyn studied the boy's slumped shoulders, the defeat creeping into his young face, and made a decision. "Come inside. I need you to do something for me." "What?" "First, fix that loose board by the back door. Then I want you to check every other possible entry point. Windows, foundation, anywhere something could get in." Wade frowned. "You think the snake—" "I think your family has had remarkably bad luck lately. Fences cut, cattle scattered, snakes in the pantry, each one explainable as accident. Altogether?" She met his eyes squarely. "That starts to look like a pattern." Understanding dawned slowly, followed by anger. "Someone's doing this. Someone's trying to make us so miserable, we just give up and leave." That would be my assessment." "We should tell Pa—" "And what would your father do?" Evelyn interrupted. "Ride into town and accuse Preston Hale of sabotage without proof? March into the sheriff's office when the sheriff is clearly in the banker's pocket? All that accomplishes is putting a target on your backs and making Hale move faster." Wade stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "Who are you, really?" "I'm your housekeeper, who used to work in a place where powerful men destroyed people as casually as you'd swat a fly." Evelyn picked up her bucket. "Now I'm going to clean this kitchen properly. You're going to secure this house. And tonight, when your father comes home exhausted and defeated, we're going to feed him a decent meal and let him believe, for one evening, that something in his life is getting better instead of worse." "Why are you helping us?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything the boy wasn't saying. "We can't pay you much. You don't owe us anything. Everyone else runs." Evelyn considered several answers. The truth was complicated. She needed the hiding place. She understood what it meant to be hunted. She'd spent 3 years running and was tired of it. But what came out was simpler and maybe more honest. "Because I'm tired of watching people with nothing get crushed by people with everything. Now go fix that board." Wade went, moving with new purpose, and Evelyn returned to the kitchen. But as she worked, scrubbing surfaces and inventorying supplies, her mind was occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with cooking. Preston Hale wanted this ranch. The question was why. The land was decent but not exceptional. The water rights were valuable, but so were a dozen other properties in the valley. What made the Cole Ranch worth this much effort? She needed information, real information, not guesses and theories, which meant she needed to go to town. The thought made her stomach tighten. Going to town meant being seen, being remembered, risking the kind of attention that had gotten her noticed in Sacramento, in Carson City, and every other place she'd tried to hide before some detail, a turn of phrase, a piece of knowledge she shouldn't have, a moment when her carefully constructed persona slipped, gave her away. But staying hidden in this house wouldn't save the Coles. And if the Coles lost the ranch, Evelyn lost her hiding place. Sometimes survival meant taking risks. She was still weighing options when Garrett returned near sunset, his shoulders bent and his face carved from exhaustion. He unsaddled his horse in silence, waved off Wade's attempt at conversation, and came into the house like a man walking to his own hanging. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight, and froze. The kitchen gleamed, not perfectly. 3 days couldn't undo years of neglect, but it was clean in a way that spoke of care rather than desperation. The table was set with mismatched plates that had been scrubbed until they shone. Something was cooking that actually smelled like food. And standing at the stove, calm as a judge, was the housekeeper he'd half expected to find gone. "You're still here," he said, and it came out more surprised than he probably intended. "Where else would I be?" Evelyn turned from the stove. "Supper's almost ready. There's coffee if you want it." Garrett moved to the table like a man in a dream, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. He'd been up since before dawn, had ridden hard, had faced Thompson's smug satisfaction and the sheriff's thinly veiled contempt, had come home knowing he was one disaster away from losing everything. And his kitchen was clean. It was such a small thing. Stupid to let it matter. But it did. "Wade said there was a snake," he said after a long silence. "There was. I killed it." "He said you used a skillet." "It was nearby." Garrett almost smiled. The expression looked foreign on his face, like he'd forgotten how. Most women would have screamed. "I'm not most women." Evelyn set a plate in front of him, venison stew made from meat she'd found in the cold cellar, stretched with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and thickened with the last of the flour before she'd burned it. "Eat." He ate, too tired to argue or question. The children came in one by one, Wade quiet and thoughtful, Lila suspicious, Ben openly delighted. And they sat down to a meal that felt almost normal, almost like a family instead of a collection of people surviving in proximity. "Mr. Thompson's claiming 3 head, Garrett said eventually, his voice flat. "Says they damaged his property. Sheriff sided with him." "Of course he did," Lila muttered. "Lila." "It's true, Pa. Everyone knows the sheriff does what Mr. Hale tells him." Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's not how the law works. That's how it works here." The girl wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. Garrett stabbed at his stew, anger and helplessness warring on his face. "I'll figure something out." "Maybe you don't have to figure it out alone," Evelyn said quietly. All eyes turned to her. Garrett's were wary. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to town tomorrow. To the mercantile, to purchase supplies we desperately need." She met his gaze steadily. "And while I'm there, I might happen to overhear some interesting conversations. People talk around housekeepers. We're invisible that way." "You want to spy on Hale?" "I want to understand what we're dealing with. There's a difference." Evelyn set down her fork. "Your family is being squeezed, Mr. Cole. Systematically and deliberately. Fences don't cut themselves. Snakes don't crawl into flower bins by accident. And if Preston Hale wants this ranch badly enough to wage this kind of campaign, I'd like to know why." Wade was nodding along, clearly ready to sign up for whatever plan involved fighting back. Lila looked torn between hope and skepticism. Ben just looked confused. Garrett looked exhausted. "Miss Hart, I know what you're going to say. That this isn't my fight, that you didn't hire me to make enemies in town, that I should stay here and keep house, and stay out of trouble." Evelyn's voice stayed calm, but her eyes were steel. "But here's the truth, Mr. Cole. If this ranch fails, I lose the position I came here for. So whether you like it or not, your problems are now my problems, and I don't lose." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and Ben's spoon scraping his plate. Garrett studied this strange woman who'd appeared in his life 2 days ago and was now proposing to walk into danger on his behalf. "You don't know these people," he said finally. "Hale's got connections. Sheriff fucking does whatever Hale wants. Half the town owes the bank money. If you start asking questions, then I'll be very careful about how I ask them." Evelyn stood, gathering plates. "I'm not proposing to march into the bank and demand answers. I'm proposing to be exactly what everyone thinks I am. A housekeeper buying supplies and keeping her ears open. People reveal more than they know when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't matter. And if they figure out you're not just a housekeeper, then I'll deal with it." She carried the plates to the wash basin. "But I've been underestimated before, Mr. Cole. It's surprisingly useful." Garrett wanted to argue. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup. He was a man used to carrying his burdens alone, used to protecting his children even when it crushed him. The idea of letting someone else, especially a woman he barely knew, step into danger on his behalf went against everything he was. But he was also a man who was drowning, and sometimes drowning men had to accept help even when pride screamed against it. "All right," he said quietly, "but you take Wade with you. And if anything feels wrong, you get out. No arguments, no heroics. You just leave." "Agreed. I mean it, Miss Hart. These people, they're not above hurting women if you get in their way." Evelyn met his eyes, and for just a moment, her careful facade cracked enough to show what lay beneath: steel and scars, and the kind of knowledge that came from surviving things that should have killed her. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "I promise you, I know exactly what kind of people they are." Something in her tone made Garrett's eyes narrow, made him look at her like he was seeing past the proper dress and the housekeeper's manners to whoever was hiding underneath. But before he could ask the questions clearly forming, Ben interrupted. "Can I go to town too?" "No," Garrett and Evelyn said simultaneously. "School," Evelyn added. "All of you. Regular schedule. The more normal everything looks, the better." Lila crossed her arms. "I could help. You can help by not giving Preston Hale any reason to think this family is doing anything except struggling to survive." Evelyn's voice was kind but firm. "Trust me, the best weapon you have right now is looking defeated." "We're not defeated," Wade said hotly. "I know. But Hale doesn't need to know that." Evelyn dried her hands on her apron. "Now, dishes, homework, bed. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." The children scattered with the kind of grumbling obedience that suggested they were getting used to following her orders. When they were gone, Garrett remained at the table, turning his empty coffee cup in his hands. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked without looking up. Evelyn could have deflected, could have repeated the practical reasons: the job, the shelter, the mutual benefit. Instead, she found herself telling a piece of truth she hadn't planned to share. "Because 3 years ago, I watched a powerful man destroy innocent people to protect his own interests. I watched him use the law and money and fear to crush anyone who stood against him, and I ran instead of fighting." She paused, remembering Sacramento, remembering the senator's cold eyes, and the choice she'd made to survive instead of stand. "I'm tired of running, Mr. Cole, and I'm tired of watching people like Preston Hale win." Garrett looked up at her then, really looked, and she could see him trying to reconcile the calm housekeeper with whatever he was hearing in her words. "You're not just a housekeeper." "No, but that's what I need to be right now." Evelyn moved toward the stairs. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we find out what Hale's really after." She left him there in the lamplight, surrounded by clean dishes and the smell of a home-cooked meal and the dangerous feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Upstairs, in her small room with its leaking roof and sticking door, Evelyn pulled out her carpet bag and began preparing. Not with weapons, she'd left those behind when she started running, but with something more dangerous. Information. Strategy. The kind of patient, careful planning that had kept her alive when men with guns and badges had been hunting her. She pulled out the notebook where she'd started mapping what she knew. Preston Hale, banker, connections to the sheriff, pressuring the Coles to sell. But why this ranch specifically? What made it worth the systematic destruction of a family? She needed to see the land records, needed to know what property Hale already owned, what he'd been buying up, what pattern might emerge if she could see the whole picture instead of just this one piece. And she needed to do it without revealing that she knew how to read legal documents, how to trace ownership through shell companies and proxy buyers, how to follow money trails the way she'd learned to do in her previous life. The life where she'd been Mara Quinn, legal clerk to Senator Aldrich Morrison. The life where she'd uncovered proof that the senator was selling federal land rights to foreign investors and killing anyone who threatened to expose him. The life that had ended the night she'd fled Sacramento with nothing but the documents in her carpet bag and a bounty on her head. Evelyn Hart was a fiction, a character she'd created to survive, but Mara Quinn's skills, those were real. Those she could use. She just had to be very, very careful that no one in Copper Creek learned that their timid housekeeper knew more about land law and financial fraud than most lawyers. A knock on her door interrupted her planning. "Miss Hart?" Wade's voice, uncertain. "Can I talk to you?" Evelyn slipped the notebook back into the carpet bag and opened the door. The boy stood in the hallway, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I thought you should have this," he said, holding it out. "Just in case." She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small pistol, old but well-maintained, the kind a woman might carry in her bag or keep by her bedside. "It was my mother's," Wade said quietly. "Pa gave it to her when they first moved out here. She knew how to shoot. Rattlesnakes, coyotes, whatever needed shooting." He swallowed hard. "If you're going up against hail, you should be able to protect yourself." Evelyn looked at the gun, at this offering from a 14-year-old boy who was trying so hard to be the man his father needed him to be. The weight of it was familiar. She'd carried one like it before, though she'd ditched it 2 towns back when traveling armed drew too much attention. "Wade, I appreciate this, but please." His voice cracked slightly. "I know you're not just a housekeeper. I don't know what you're running from, and I don't care. But you're the first person who's looked at our situation and decided to fight instead of run. So please, take it." She could have refused. Probably should have. Carrying a gun meant complications, meant questions if anyone saw it, meant stepping closer to violence she'd been trying to leave behind. But she took it anyway. Because Wade was right. If she was going to walk into Preston Hale's territory and start poking at his plans, she needed to be prepared for what might happen when he realized she wasn't as harmless as she looked. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be careful with it. I know you will." He hesitated in the doorway. "Miss Hart, what you said earlier about being tired of watching people get crushed, did you try to stop them? The people who were hurting others?" Evelyn met his eyes, this boy who was already learning that sometimes trying wasn't enough, that good intentions couldn't stop bad men with power. "I tried," she said quietly. "And I failed. And I've been running ever since." "But you're not running now." "No, I'm not." Wade nodded slowly, processing this. "Then maybe this time will be different. Maybe it will." He left her then, heading back to the room he shared with Ben, and Evelyn closed the door. She checked the pistol methodically, loaded, 5 rounds, well-oiled, then wrapped it back in its cloth and placed it carefully in her carpet bag. Tomorrow she'd go to town. She'd play the role of proper housekeeper, soft-spoken and invisible. She'd buy flour and coffee and whatever else the mercantile had. And while she was there, she'd listen. She'd watch. She'd gather the information that might save this family or get them all killed. Outside her window, the valley was dark under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, Preston Hale was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his plans, secure in his power. He'd crushed the Coles almost to nothing. A few more weeks, maybe a month, and they'd break completely. He didn't know that his careful campaign had just gained an opponent who'd spent 3 years learning how to fight from the shadows, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone overlooked. Evelyn Hart was a fiction, but she was a useful one, and tomorrow she'd start using her invisibility as a weapon. She blew out the lamp and lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere below, Garrett was probably still sitting at the kitchen table, trying to figure out how to save his ranch with the few options he had left. Down the hall, Wade was lying awake, hoping this new housekeeper might be the miracle they needed. And in the other bedroom, Lila was probably planning ways to test whether Evelyn would really stay. None of them knew the truth, that their housekeeper was wanted for murder in 3 territories, that she carried evidence that could bring down a senator and everyone connected to him. That she'd chosen Copper Creek not because she wanted to help them, but because she'd run out of places to hide. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that she was here now, and she'd decided to stand instead of run. And tomorrow she'd walk into town and start the kind of careful, dangerous work that either saved everyone or destroyed them all. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep, the pistol's weight in her carpet bag a reminder that some things you couldn't run from. Some fights found you no matter how far you went. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly where you were supposed to be. The morning came cold and sharp, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Evelyn dressed carefully in her most respectable outfit, the black dress with its high collar and modest sleeves, her hair pinned severely back, her expression schooled into the kind of pleasant neutrality that made people's eyes slide right past her. She looked exactly like what Copper Creek expected. A spinster housekeeper, prim and forgettable, no threat to anyone. The pistol went into her carpet bag, wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath a shawl and her small purse. Just in case. Wade was waiting by the wagon when she came downstairs, already hitched and ready. Garrett stood nearby, his face tight with worry he was trying to hide. "Stay together," he told Wade. "Don't let her go anywhere alone. And if Hale or any of his men approach you, we leave." "I know, Pa." Wade's hand rested casually near his belt, where Evelyn could see the outline of a knife sheathed there. The boy was learning to prepare for trouble. She wasn't sure if that was reassuring or heartbreaking. Garrett turned to Evelyn. "You don't have to do this." "I know." She climbed onto the wagon seat, settling her skirts. "But I'm going to anyway." He held her gaze for a long moment. This man who'd stopped trusting people somewhere along the road between his wife's death and his ranch's slow collapse. She could see him wanting to say something, a warning, maybe, or a question about who she really was and why she cared. Instead, he just nodded. "Be careful." "Always am." Wade clicked to the horses and they rolled out, leaving Garrett standing in the yard watching them go like a man watching his last hope ride away. Lila and Ben stood at the window, pressed against the glass, and Evelyn made herself not look back. The road to Copper Creek wound through grassland that would have been beautiful if desperation hadn't soaked into every mile of it. They passed other ranches, some doing better than the Coles, some worse, all of them bearing the marks of hard years and harder choices. A few people waved. Most just watched the wagon pass with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested they'd already written off the Cole family and didn't want the association. "They used to be friendlier," Wade said quietly. "Before Ma died, before the debts got bad, people used to help each other out here. What changed?" "Hale bought the bank 3 years ago, started calling in loans, raising interest rates, offering to help people by buying their land for less than it's worth." Wade's hands were tight on the reins. Anyone who stood up to him found their luck going bad. Accidents, problems. The kind of things that make people decide maybe selling isn't such a bad idea after all. And the ones who sold? Got run off or broken down until they left anyway. Hale doesn't want neighbors. He wants property. The boy's voice was bitter beyond his years. "Pa says it's the new way. Big operations buying up the small ones. Says we're dying out like buffalo." "Your father's wrong about one thing," Evelyn said. "Buffalo died because they couldn't fight back." "You can." Wade glanced at her, something like hope flickering across his face before caution smothered it. "How? We've got no money, no influence, no—" "You've got the truth, and you've got me." She straightened her spine, looking ahead to where Copper Creek's buildings were starting to appear through the morning haze. "Sometimes that's enough." The town was bigger than Evelyn had expected, a main street with actual boardwalks, 24 buildings ranging from substantial to ramshackle, and enough people moving about to suggest this was more than just a wide spot in the road. The bank sat prominently at the center of town, a 2-story brick building that looked newer and more solid than anything around it. A statement of permanence and power. Preston Hale's castle. Wade parked the wagon outside the Mercantile, a weathered building that smelled of coffee and tobacco and the particular mustiness of dry goods left too long on the shelf. The proprietor looked up as they entered, a thin man with suspicious eyes and a ledger he closed a little too quickly. "Help you?" "Flour, coffee, sugar if you have it," Evelyn said. her voice soft and deferential. Salt pork, beans, whatever vegetables are still good. The Cole household is running low on supplies. The man's expression soured slightly at the Cole name. They got credit to cover that? I have cash. Evelyn produced coins from her purse. Not much, but enough to make the point that she wasn't asking for charity. His demeanor shifted immediately. Money was money, even from a failing ranch. All right then. All right, Wade, you know where things are. Help yourself. While Wade gathered supplies, Evelyn drifted through the store with the aimless quality of a woman with time to kill. She examined fabric she had no intention of buying, sorted through sewing notions, lingered near the counter where the proprietor was talking to another customer. Heard Thompson got 3 head off Cole yesterday, the customer was saying. That's gotta hurt. Garrett Cole's been hurting for 2 years. This is just another nail. The proprietor kept his voice low, but not low enough. Hale's got patience, I'll give him that. Could have foreclosed months ago, but he's letting them bleed out slow. Makes the other holdouts nervous. Other holdouts? The Jamesons, the widow Chen, anyone still refusing to sell. The proprietor leaned closer. Word is Hale's got plans, big plans. Needs the whole valley, not just pieces of it. Something about water rights and a railroad spur, but that's above my pay to know for sure. Evelyn's fingers stilled on the ribbon she'd been examining. Water rights and railroad access. That was why Hale wanted the Cole Ranch specifically. It controlled creek access that must be crucial for whatever development he was planning. Remove the Coles and the remaining holdouts would be cut off from water, making their land worthless. It was elegant, in a vicious sort of way. And it meant Hale wouldn't stop until Garrett either sold or died. She filed this information away and moved on, purchasing her supplies with quiet efficiency while Wade loaded them into the wagon. They were almost done when a shadow fell across the boardwalk. Preston Hale was exactly the kind of man Evelyn had expected, mid-40s, well-fed, wearing clothes too fine for a frontier town, and carrying himself with the ease of someone who'd never been told no. He had a politician's smile and a snake's eyes, and when he looked at Evelyn, she could see him dismissing her as irrelevant before he'd even finished the glance. Perfect. Well now, Hale said, his voice smooth as oil, you must be Cole's new housekeeper. Welcome to Copper Creek, Miss Hart. Evelyn Hart. She kept her eyes downcast, her posture submissive. Just another timid woman, no threat at all. Charming. How are you finding the Cole Ranch? His tone suggested he already knew the answer and was enjoying asking anyway. It's a beautiful property. The valley is lovely. Lovely, but struggling, I'm afraid. Poor Garrett's been dealt a hard hand these past years. Hale's expression arranged itself into something meant to look like concern. I do hope he's treating you well. The last few housekeepers didn't stay long. Mr. Cole has been perfectly courteous. Good, good. Though I have to wonder how long he can afford to keep paying you, what with the debts mounting and the cattle losses. Hale pulled out a cigar, made a show of lighting it. If you find yourself in need of new employment, Miss Hart, I know several respectable families who could use someone with your capabilities. The way he said capabilities made it clear he was already planning for her to leave the Coles and had probably even picked out which of his associates would hire her next. Everything was a chess move with men like this. That's very kind, Mr. Hale, but I'm quite content where I am. For now, he smiled, exhaling smoke. Things change quickly out here, Miss Hart. A woman alone needs to be practical. Remember that. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not one either. Wade had gone tense beside her, his hand drifting toward his belt, and Evelyn touched his arm gently in warning. I'll keep that in mind. Good day, Mr. Hale. She turned away, dismissing him with the kind of politeness that was its own small rebellion. She felt his eyes on her back as they climbed into the wagon, felt him measuring and calculating and ultimately deciding she was nothing worth worrying about. Good. Let him think that. Let him underestimate the quiet housekeeper in her modest dress. They were halfway out of town when Wade finally spoke. I wanted to hit him. I know. The way he talked about Pa, about the ranch, like it was already his, that's because he thinks it is. Evelyn kept her voice low, aware that sound carried an open country. He's already won in his mind. That makes him confident, and confidence makes people careless. You sound like you've done this before. Let's just say I've known men like Preston Hale. They follow patterns, and patterns can be broken if you know where to push. Wade was quiet for a long moment, the wagon wheels creaking through the ruts. Then, what did you hear in the mercantile? So he'd noticed her careful eavesdropping. The boy was sharp. Water rights and railroad access. Hale's not just buying up ranches for grazing land. He's assembling something bigger, probably a development deal with outside money. Your ranch controls access to the creek that feeds the valley. Without it, the other holdouts' land becomes worthless. So we're the keystone. If we fall, everyone else falls with us. Exactly. Evelyn watched the landscape roll past, her mind already working through implications and possibilities. Which means we need to find out who Hale's working with and what they're really planning. Railroad companies file permits. Development deals leave paper trails. If we can find the evidence, we can stop him. Maybe. Or at least slow him down enough to find another option. She glanced at Wade. Do you know anyone in town who might talk to us? Someone who's not in Hale's pocket. Wade considered this. Mrs. Chen, maybe? The widow who runs the boarding house. She hates Hale because he tried to buy her out after her husband died, offered her pennies and called it generosity. His expression darkened. And there's Sam Brokenhorn. He's Shoshone, works odd jobs around town. Hale treats him like dirt, so Sam's got no love for the man. But I don't know if either of them knows anything useful. Everyone knows something. The question is whether they'll share it. Evelyn filed the names away. We'll approach them carefully, one person at a time. No pressure, no demands, just conversation. And what if Hale finds out we're asking questions? Then we make sure he doesn't find out until we've got enough evidence to hurt him. Evelyn's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. The trick isn't avoiding attention entirely. It's making sure that when attention comes, you're ready for it. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Evelyn was calculating odds and risks, mapping out approaches and backup plans, falling into the kind of strategic thinking that had kept her alive through 3 years of running. Wade was probably doing the same thing in his own way, this 14-year-old who'd been forced to grow up too fast and learn too young that the world wasn't fair. They were almost back to the ranch when they saw the smoke. It rose in a thin black column from the direction of the Cole property, visible for miles against the clear autumn sky. Wade made a sound like he'd been punched and snapped the reins, sending the horses into a gallop that rattled the wagon and sent supplies sliding in the bed. Evelyn grabbed the seat to keep from being thrown, her heart hammering as they raced toward whatever disaster had struck now. Another fence broken, another accident, another piece of Hale's campaign to break them. But when they crested the rise and saw the ranch spread out below, it wasn't the house burning. It was the hay barn. Flames engulfed the old structure, eating through dried grass and timber with the kind of hunger that couldn't be stopped. Garrett and Lila were hauling water from the creek in a desperate attempt to save the nearby buildings, while Ben sat in the dirt crying and the horses screamed in the corral, wild with panic. Wade jumped from the moving wagon and ran, already yelling for his father. Evelyn followed, her mind racing through calculations. The barn was lost. That was obvious. But the horses were still alive, trapped in a corral that was rapidly filling with smoke and embers. She ran past Garrett without speaking, heading straight for the corral gate. The horses were wheeling in panic, eyes white, muscles bunched to bolt. Getting in there was suicide. Opening the gate meant they'd stampede, but leaving them meant they'd burn. Evelyn made her choice in the space between heartbeats. She threw open the gate and stepped directly into the path of the lead horse. A big roan stallion Garrett had mentioned once as being too mean to ride but too valuable to sell. The horse bore down on her like thunder, and she stood her ground, arms wide, voice cutting through the chaos. Easy! Easy now! The stallion tried to dodge around her. She moved with him, staying in his path, using her body and voice to force him to see her as something other than an obstacle. Behind her, Garrett was shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of flames and hoofbeats. Didn't matter. She was committed now. The stallion reared, hooves flashing inches from her face, and Evelyn grabbed his halter with both hands and held on. He came down hard, still fighting, still wild with panic, but she'd gotten his attention now, had forced him to focus on her instead of the fire. That's it, she said, her voice somehow calm despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "We're leaving, but we're leaving together. You understand?" She had no idea if horses understood anything beyond fear and food, but the stallion's ears flicked toward her voice. The other horses were milling in confusion, caught between following their leader and the panic of the flames. Evelyn started walking backward, still gripping the halter, pulling the stallion with her. He resisted, tossing his head, but she'd given him something to focus on that wasn't terror. 1 step, 2, 3. She kept talking, kept moving, kept her body between the horse and his panic. They cleared the corral. The other horses followed, streaming past her in a rush of muscle and mane and the smell of smoke-soaked horsehide. She felt the stallion start to bolt, felt him gathering himself to run, and knew if he went now, he'd take her with him, and she'd be trampled or dragged, and either way probably killed. So she did the only thing she could think of. She vaulted onto his back. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't skilled, but 3 years of running had taught her to move fast and commit fully, and sometimes that was enough. She landed hard across the stallion's bare back, grabbed a fistful of mane, and held on as the horse exploded into motion. They raced away from the burning barn, away from the ranch buildings, away from everything. The stallion ran like the devil was behind him, and maybe it was. Fire and fear were close enough. Evelyn clung to his back, her dress hiked up around her knees in a way that would have scandalized Copper Creek's proper ladies, her carefully pinned hair coming loose, her whole body focused on the simple act of not falling off. She'd ridden as a girl, before Sacramento, before the senator, before everything changed. But this wasn't riding. This was barely controlled falling with hoofbeats. The stallion ran until he couldn't run anymore, until his sides were heaving and foam flecked his neck. They ended up in a draw a half-mile from the ranch, surrounded by cottonwoods and the sound of running water. The horse stood shaking, nostrils flared, and Evelyn slid off his back on legs that almost didn't hold her. "It's all right," she told him, her voice raw from smoke and shouting. "You're all right now." The stallion looked at her with eyes that had gone from white-rimmed panic to something almost like recognition. She'd saved him. He seemed to understand that in whatever way horses understood such things. Evelyn checked him over quickly. No burns, no injuries beyond some singed hair and the terror that would take time to fade. Then she looked back toward the ranch where smoke still rose in a pillar that would be visible from town. Hale would know about this within the hour, would probably express his sympathy while quietly celebrating another blow to the Cole family's chances of survival. The hay barn. Gone. That was winter feed for the cattle, shelter for calves during storms, storage for equipment they couldn't afford to replace. Its loss might not be the final blow, but it was close. Evelyn grabbed the stallion's mane and hauled herself back onto his back. The horse tensed, but didn't bolt this time, as if he'd decided she was pack now. Part of his herd, worth tolerating. "Come on," she said. "Let's go face the damage." They rode back at a walk, the stallion calm now, Evelyn's mind already racing ahead to what came next. By the time they crested the rise, the barn had collapsed into itself, leaving nothing but smoking timbers and the acrid smell of destruction. The family stood in a cluster watching it burn, their faces hollow with loss. Garrett saw her first. His expression went through several rapid changes: relief that she was alive, shock at seeing her on the stallion's back, something else she couldn't quite read. She slid off the horse and walked toward them, aware that she must look wild. Hair loose, dress filthy, eyes probably still bright with the adrenaline that was only now starting to fade. "The horses?" she asked. "Scattered, but alive. Thanks to you." Garrett's voice was rough. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen. It needed doing. You could have been killed." But I wasn't. Evelyn looked at the smoldering ruin, at the devastation of months of work and planning. "Was anyone hurt?" "No." Lila smelled smoke and got Ben out. "I was checking the north fence when it started." Garrett's hands clenched into fists. "It happened too fast to be accidental. Someone set this." Wade stepped forward, his face grim. "I found this near the barn." He held up a piece of oiled rag, the kind used to start fires quickly. "It was still smoldering when I grabbed it." The evidence sat in the dust between them, undeniable, damning, and completely useless without proof of who'd left it there. Evelyn could see the rage building in Garrett, the kind of desperate anger that made men do stupid things like ride into town and confront their enemies without evidence or backup. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "don't." "Don't what? Don't go to town and drag Preston Hale out of his office and make him admit what he's done?" Garrett's voice was shaking. "That bastard just destroyed my winter hay. My cattle will starve. My children will—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "And if you go after him now, without proof, without a plan, he'll have you arrested for assault. Or worse." Evelyn met his eyes steadily. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But anger without strategy is just another way to lose." "So what do you suggest? We just let him get away with this?" "No. We make him pay for it. But we do it right." She gestured to the smoking barn, to the frightened children, to everything they stood to lose. "This was meant to break you, to make you desperate enough to either lash out stupidly or give up entirely. Don't give Hale what he wants." Garrett stared at her, breathing hard, clearly fighting the urge to saddle a horse and ride for town anyway. Behind him, Wade was nodding slowly, understanding starting to dawn. Lila just looked scared, holding Ben close. "What do we do?" Garrett asked finally, the words pulled from somewhere deep and painful. Evelyn looked at the family gathered around the ashes of their barn, at the valley spreading out behind them, at the town in the distance where Preston Hale was probably already hearing about his latest success. She thought about the information she'd gathered, the patterns emerging, the sense that they were running out of time to make a move that mattered. "We gather evidence," she said. "We find out exactly what Hale's planning and who he's working with. We document everything, every attack, every threat, every piece of this campaign he's been waging." She paused, letting them see the steel beneath her careful facade. "And then we don't just defend ourselves. We destroy him." The words hung in the smoke-thick air like a promise. Or a threat? Or both? Wade straightened, something like hope flickering across his young face. Lila's grip on Ben loosened slightly. And Garrett looked at this housekeeper who'd appeared in his life less than a week ago and was now proposing to wage war against the most powerful man in the valley. "You sound certain we can win," he said. "No, I sound certain we're going to try." Evelyn's voice was steady despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. "Winning isn't guaranteed, Mr. Cole, but I promise you this. If we're going down, we're taking Preston Hale with us." They spent that night in a house that smelled of smoke and defeat, the windows still glowing orange from embers that refused to die. Evelyn made soup from the supplies they'd bought that morning, a lifetime ago it seemed now, and watched the Cole family eat in silence. Even Ben had stopped asking questions, his 6-year-old face drawn tight with the understanding that something terrible had happened and the adults couldn't fix it. Garrett pushed his bowl away half-finished and stood. "I'm going to check the horses one more time." It was an excuse to leave, to escape the weight of his children's eyes and the ruin visible through every window. Evelyn let him go. Some men needed to fall apart alone before they could stand back up. When the children were finally in bed, Wade pretending he wasn't scared, Lila holding Ben like she could protect him from the world through sheer stubbornness, Evelyn retreated to her room and pulled out the carpet bag. The documents inside represented 3 years of running, 3 years of evidence she'd been too afraid to use because using them meant standing still long enough to be found. But she was standing still now. Whether she'd meant to or not, she'd chosen this place, this family, this fight. She spread the papers across her narrow bed, years of legal training coming back like muscle memory. Senator Morrison's correspondence with foreign investors, land transfer documents with suspicious signatures, bank records showing money flowing through shell companies. None of it directly mentioned Copper Creek or Preston Hale, but the patterns were there. The same shell companies, the same legal maneuvering, the same careful construction of plausible deniability. Morrison had done this before. Built empires on stolen land and called it progress. And if Hale was working with the same people, using the same methods, then Evelyn knew exactly what to look for. A knock interrupted her thoughts. She gathered the papers quickly, sliding them back into the bag before opening the door. Garrett stood in the hallway, his face haggard in the lamplight. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside, letting him enter. He moved to the window, staring out at the darkness where the barn had been, his shoulders rigid with tension. "I'm going to lose the ranch," he said finally. "The hay was our winter feed. Without it, I'll have to sell most of the herd just to keep the rest alive. And even if I do that, even if I make it through winter, Hale owns the note on this place. He can call it due any time he wants." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm out of moves, Miss Hart. I'm just too proud to admit it yet." Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap, and chose her words carefully. "What if I told you Hale's not just squeezing you for the ranch? That he's part of something bigger, and if we can prove it, we might be able to stop him?" Garrett turned from the window. "What do you mean?" "The mercantile proprietor mentioned railroad access and water rights. That's not ranching, Mr. Cole. That's development. Someone's planning to build something here, a rail spur, maybe a town, something that needs water and land and legal access." She paused. "And I think Preston Hale is just the local face of a much larger operation, which means he's vulnerable." "To what? We can't out-lawyer him, can't outspend him." "No, but we can expose him." Evelyn pulled the carpetbag into her lap, her fingers resting on the worn leather. "I used to work for powerful men, Mr. Cole. I know how they think, how they operate. They build empires on paper trails and plausible deniability. But paper trails can be followed. And plausible deniability only works until someone looks close enough to see the truth." Garrett studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Who are you, really?" The question she'd been avoiding since she arrived. Evelyn could deflect, could maintain the fiction of Evelyn Hart, respectable housekeeper. But this man had just watched his barn burn and was still standing. He deserved better than lies. "My name is Mara Quinn," she said quietly. 3 years ago, I worked as a legal clerk for Senator Aldrich Morrison in Sacramento. I discovered he was selling federal land rights to foreign investors and using his position to cover the fraud. When I tried to report it, he had me framed for murder." She met Garrett's eyes steadily. "I've been running ever since. The documents in this bag are proof of everything he did, but using them means revealing where I am. And revealing where I am means men with badges and guns will come for me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Garrett's expression was unreadable, processing this information, weighing what it meant. "You're wanted by the law." "By corrupt men pretending to be the law. There's a difference." "Not much of one when they've got guns." He exhaled slowly. "So you came here to hide, and now you're proposing to come out of hiding to help us. That about right?" "That's right." "Why? We can't protect you, can barely protect ourselves." Evelyn stood, moving to the window to look out at the valley bathed in starlight. "Because I'm tired of running, Mr. Cole. Tired of letting men like Morrison and Hale destroy people while I hide. And because—" She stopped, surprised by the emotion rising in her throat. "Because your children look at you like you hung the moon, and you look at them like they're the only thing keeping you alive, and I'll be damned if I let Preston Hale take that away." When she turned back, Garrett was watching her with something new in his expression. Not quite trust, that took time, but maybe the beginning of it. The recognition that they were both fighting for something worth the risk. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Time, access to town, and your trust that I know what I'm doing." She hesitated. "And if this goes wrong, if my past catches up with us, you need to be ready to deny everything. Say I deceived you, that you had no idea who I was. Protect your children, even if it means throwing me to the wolves." "I won't. You will. Because they matter more than pride or loyalty to a woman you've known for a week." Her voice was steel. "Promise me, Mr. Cole. If it comes to that, you'll save your family first." Garrett's jaw worked, clearly hating the demand but understanding the logic behind it. "All right, I promise. But it's not going to come to that." "You don't know that." "No, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Mara Quinn, that your real name?" "It is." "Well, Mara Quinn, welcome to the fight. Try not to get us all killed." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "I'll do my best." He left her then, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and Evelyn returned to her documents. But now she wasn't just looking for patterns. She was looking for weapons. Anything that could connect Morrison's operation to Hale, that could prove the conspiracy ran deeper than just one banker squeezing one family. She worked through the night, cross-referencing names and dates, building a timeline of corruption that stretched from Sacramento to Copper Creek. When dawn came gray and cold through her window, she had the beginnings of a case. And she had a plan. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of careful maneuvering and gathering intelligence. Evelyn made regular trips to town, always with Wade, always playing the role of unremarkable housekeeper. She befriended Mrs. Chen at the boarding house over tea and sympathy, learning that Hale had tried to buy Chen's property for a fraction of its value the week after her husband's death. She spoke with Sam Broken Horn at the livery stable, trading respect for information, discovering that Hale had recently hosted visitors from San Francisco. Railroad men, Sam thought, though he couldn't be sure. Each piece of information fit into the larger picture forming in Evelyn's mind. Hale wasn't working alone. He was the local agent for something much bigger. A development company, probably, backed by the same investors Morrison had worked with. They wanted the valley, wanted the water rights and railroad access, and were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The question was how to prove it before they destroyed the coals entirely. Garrett, meanwhile, threw himself into salvaging what he could. He sold half his herd at terrible prices, bought emergency hay from a neighbor who charged 3 times the going rate, and worked from dawn to dusk trying to shore up fences and prepare for winter. The children returned to school, though Lila reported that the other students whispered about the fire, about the Cole family's bad luck, about how long before they lost everything. The valley was watching them die slowly, and some were placing bets on when the end would come. Then, 2 weeks after the barn burned, Preston Hale made his move. Evelyn was in town buying thread when she saw the posters going up. Official-looking notices on heavy paper, signed by the territorial governor's office, announcing a land rights hearing to be held in Copper Creek in 10 days. Any disputes regarding water access, grazing rights, or property boundaries could be brought before the territorial judge for final arbitration. It was brilliant, in a vicious sort of way. Hale had engineered a legal mechanism to take everything at once, using the authority of the territory itself. He'd probably already bribed the judge, already filed his claims, already prepared the paperwork to transfer the disputed properties to his name. The hearing was the final trap, and the Coles were walking straight into it. Evelyn bought her thread and rode back to the ranch in silence, Wade sensing her tension but smart enough not to press. When they arrived, she found Garrett in the barn, the tool shed they were using since the hay barn burned, repairing tack with hands that shook slightly. "There's a hearing," she said without preamble. 10 days. Hale's going to use it to take the ranch legally. Garrett's hands stilled. How? Water rights dispute, probably. He'll claim you've been using more than your legal allocation, damaging downstream properties. He'll have affidavits from neighbors, surveys showing encroachment, maybe even testimony that you've been aggressive toward anyone who questioned your boundaries. She leaned against the doorframe. It doesn't matter if it's true. He owns the sheriff, probably owns the judge. By the time that hearing's over, you'll have lost everything and it'll look legal on paper. Then we don't go to the hearing. If you don't go, you lose by default. The ruling goes against you in absentia, and Hale forecloses the next day. Evelyn's voice was calm despite the urgency thrumming through her veins. This is the endgame, Mr. Cole. He's been bleeding you for 2 years, and now he's ready to finish it. Garrett threw the tack down, leather hitting dirt with a dull thud. So what do? We can't win against a rigged judge, can't fight claims we don't even know he's making yet. We're finished. Not yet. Evelyn pulled a folded paper from her pocket, notes she'd made that morning, connecting pieces that had finally clicked into place. Hale's vulnerable. He's been so focused on breaking you quietly that he's left evidence everywhere. The cut fences, the barn fire, the systematic pressure on every holdout in the valley. If we can document the pattern, prove he's been waging a campaign of sabotage and intimidation, we can flip this hearing on him. With what proof? Our word against his. With testimony from every family he's destroyed. With bank records showing predatory lending practices. With evidence that his development plans violate territorial law regarding water rights and indigenous land claims. She met his eyes. And with documents showing his investors are foreign nationals using shell companies to circumvent federal restrictions on land ownership. Garrett's expression shifted from despair to something dangerous. Hope, maybe. Or the kind of desperate determination that made men fight when they should surrender. You have those documents. I have documents showing the pattern in other territories. If Hale's working with the same people, and everything suggests he is, then we can establish the connection. Make it about more than just your ranch. Make it about a conspiracy to defraud the territory and violate federal law. That's ambitious. That's necessary. Evelyn straightened. Hale thinks he's untouchable because he's kept everything local, kept it looking like legitimate business. But the moment this becomes federal jurisdiction, the moment we can show foreign money and land fraud, his protection evaporates. The territorial governor can't ignore that. The judge can't rule in his favor without exposing himself. And if we're wrong, if we go to that hearing and accuse him of all this and can't prove it, then we lose everything and I probably get arrested for the murder I didn't commit. Evelyn's voice was steady. But we're going to lose anyway if we don't try. At least this way we fight back. Garrett studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd walked into his failing ranch 3 weeks ago and was now proposing to wage legal war against forces that had destroyed better men. You really think we can win? I think we can make them bleed, and sometimes that's enough. She paused. But I need 10 days, Mr. Cole. 10 days to gather evidence, build the case, and prepare for that hearing. Can you hold things together that long? What choice do I have? You could sell, take Hale's offer, walk away with something, start over somewhere else. It had to be said, had to be offered. Your children would be safe. You'd be free of the debt. It's not a bad option. Garrett's laugh was harsh and humorless. My father built this ranch. My wife is buried on that hill overlooking the creek. My children grew up in that house. And you think I can just walk away because some banker with money and mean eyes wants it? He shook his head. No, Miss Quinn, we fight. We bleed if we have to, but we don't run. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened at the use of her real name, at the trust implied in using it. Then we'd better get started. I'll need access to the bank records. How are you going to get those? Hale's not going to just hand them over. No, but Mrs. Chen's nephew works as a clerk at the bank, and Sam Broken Horn does maintenance there after hours. People talk around the help, Mr. Cole, and sometimes the help remembers things that powerful men would rather stay forgotten. You're going to steal from the bank. I'm going to borrow information that should be public record anyway. There's a difference. Evelyn's expression was innocent. Besides, I'm just a housekeeper. What would I know about anything? Despite everything, Garrett almost smiled. You're a dangerous woman, Mara Quinn. Only to people who deserve it. The next 10 days were a controlled chaos of information gathering and careful planning. Evelyn met with Mrs. Chen's nephew in the alley behind the boarding house, trading a week's wages for copies of loan documents showing Hale's predatory interest rates and strategic foreclosures. She spoke with Sam Broken Horn by lamplight in the stable, learning about late-night meetings between Hale and well-dressed men from out of territory, about documents signed under assumed names, about money changing hands in amounts that made no sense for legitimate ranching business. She documented everything, every testimony, every document, every piece of evidence that showed Hale's campaign against the Valley's holdouts. And slowly, methodically, she built a case that connected Preston Hale to the same web of corruption that had destroyed families across 3 territories. The same web that had made her a fugitive. Garrett worked alongside her, riding to neighboring ranches to gather testimonies from families Hale had broken or was in the process of breaking. The Jamesons, who'd lost their water rights in a mysterious survey dispute. The widow Martinez, whose husband had died in a barn fire remarkably similar to the Cole's own. The Henderson brothers, forced to sell at auction after their cattle mysteriously stampeded through town, causing damages they couldn't afford to pay. The pattern was clear. Hale broke people, then bought them. And he'd been doing it for 3 years. But documentation wasn't enough. They needed theater. They needed to make the hearing into something Hale couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't silence. Which meant Evelyn had to do the one thing she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She had to stop hiding. The night before the hearing, Evelyn stood in front of her small mirror and let down her hair, watching Evelyn Hart dissolve into Mara Quinn. She dressed carefully, not in the modest black of a housekeeper, but in a deep emerald dress she'd kept packed away, the kind of thing a legal clerk might wear to court, professional, authoritative, impossible to dismiss. She looked like someone who belonged in a courtroom, like someone who knew the law and wouldn't back down from power. She looked like herself again. Finally. A knock on her door. Garrett, dressed in his best suit, threadbare but clean, worn but dignified. Behind him, Wade stood straight-backed in clothes that were slightly too small, trying to look older than 14. Lila held Ben's hand, both of them scrubbed clean and nervous. "You look different," Lila said, her voice small. "I am different. Or rather, I'm who I used to be." Evelyn picked up the carpet bag, now filled with documents instead of secrets. "Are you ready?" "No," Garrett said honestly, "but we're going anyway." They rode to town in the pre-dawn darkness. The valley spread out below them like a promise or a threat. Other families were already gathering when they arrived. The Jamesons, the widow Martinez, Henderson brothers, even Mrs. Chen, all of them drawn by the posters announcing the hearing, all of them knowing their futures hung in the balance. The hearing was being held in the town hall, a building that usually hosted dances and town meetings, but today had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Chairs lined the room, a table sat at the front for the judge, and Preston Hale occupied the best seat in the house, surrounded by lawyers and associates and the smug confidence of a man who'd already won. He saw Evelyn enter and his expression flickered, surprise at her transformation, calculation about what it meant, dismissal as he decided it didn't matter. She was still just a housekeeper playing dress-up, still just a woman without power or protection. He had no idea what was about to hit him. The judge arrived precisely at 9, a gray-haired man with tired eyes and the look of someone who'd made too many compromises and stopped caring. He took his seat, gavelled the room to order, and began the proceedings with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. Case of Preston Hale versus Garrett Cole and associated parties regarding disputed water rights and grazing boundaries in the Copper Creek Valley. Mr. Hale, you may present your claim. Hale's lawyer stood, a slick man with an expensive suit and a voice like honey over gravel. He laid out the case methodically, surveys showing the Cole Ranch had encroached on public land, affidavits from neighbors claiming water diversion, expert testimony about environmental damage. It was comprehensive, professional, and almost certainly fabricated. The judge listened with the expression of a man who'd heard this script before. When the lawyer finished, he turned to Garrett. "Mr. Cole, your response?" Garrett stood, and Evelyn saw the moment he decided to trust her completely. "Your Honor, I'd like Miss Mara Quinn to speak on my behalf. She has information relevant to these proceedings." The judge frowned. "And who is Miss Quinn?" Evelyn rose, setting the carpetbag on the table in front of her. "I'm a legal clerk, Your Honor, and I have evidence that the claims presented today are part of a systematic campaign of fraud and intimidation targeting multiple families in this valley." Hale's expression went from smug to cold in the space of a heartbeat. His lawyer started to object, but Evelyn spoke over him. "Furthermore, I have documents showing that Preston Hale is acting as an agent for foreign investors using shell companies to illegally acquire federal land in violation of territorial law. The water rights dispute is a pretext. The real crime is conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The room erupted. Hale was on his feet, his face purple with rage. His lawyer was shouting objections. The judge was gaveling for order. And Evelyn stood calm in the center of the chaos, waiting for the storm to pass. When it finally quieted, the judge's expression had shifted from bored to interested. Dangerous interest. The kind that suggested maybe he hadn't been bought quite as thoroughly as Hale believed. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Quinn. I trust you have evidence?" "I do, Your Honor." Evelyn began pulling documents from her bag, laying them out with the precision of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment. Loan documents showing predatory lending practices. Testimonies from 7 families describing identical patterns of sabotage and intimidation. Bank records showing money flowing through shell companies registered in San Francisco. And correspondence. She pulled out the final piece, the one that connected everything, between Senator Aldrich Morrison and the Western Development Corporation, discussing acquisition strategies for territorial land with water access. She met Hale's eyes across the room. The same corporation that Preston Hale represents. The same senator who has been selling federal land rights to foreign investors for 3 years. The same operation I've been documenting since I fled Sacramento to avoid being murdered for what I knew. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn could see Hale's mind racing, calculating odds, looking for exits. Could see the judge processing the implications of what had just been laid before him. Could see Garrett and his family watching her with a mixture of shock and hope. Then Hale laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. This is ridiculous. A desperate ploy by a failing rancher and his, what, his mistress? His housekeeper? He turned to the judge. Your Honor, these allegations are the ravings of a wanted criminal. Mara Quinn is a fugitive from justice, wanted for the murder of Senator Morrison's chief of staff. Everything she's said here is lies from a desperate woman trying to save herself. The accusation hung in the air. True enough to be dangerous, false enough to be a weapon. The judge looked at Evelyn. Is this correct? Are you wanted in California? I am. For a murder I didn't commit. Evelyn's voice was steady. Senator Morrison framed me when I discovered his corruption. The warrant is false, the charges are fabricated, and the man I supposedly killed is alive and well and living under an assumed name in Nevada. And you can prove this? I can provide the name and location of the supposedly dead man, yes, as well as documentation of the payoffs Morrison made to falsify the death certificate and issue the warrant. She paused. But that's not what this hearing is about, Your Honor. This is about whether Preston Hale has been systematically destroying families to acquire their land for an illegal development scheme, and I have proof that he has. The judge looked at the documents spread before him, at the testimonies and bank records and correspondence, at the faces of the families gathered in the room, all watching to see if justice was just another word for whoever had the most money. I'm going to need time to review this evidence, he said finally. This hearing is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Mr. Hale, Miss Quinn, I expect both of you to remain in town and available for questioning. His gaze hardened. And I'm sending a telegram to the territorial governor. These allegations, if proven, are beyond my jurisdiction. Hale's face went white. Your Honor, adjourned. The gavel came down like a gunshot. The room erupted again, but this time it was different. People were talking, whispering, looking at Preston Hale like they'd never seen him before. The mask of respectability was cracking, and underneath was the truth they'd all known but been too afraid to name. Evelyn gathered her documents calmly, aware that Hale was staring at her with an expression that promised violence. She'd made herself a target, had stepped out of the shadows and painted a bullseye on her own back, but she'd also just changed the game, turned a quiet land grab into a federal case, given the families of Copper Creek a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Whether they could actually win was still uncertain, but at least now they were fighting. Garrett appeared at her elbow as she finished packing. That was reckless, dangerous, possibly suicidal. Evelyn met his eyes. But necessary. They know who you are now. Morrison will hear about this. He'll send people. I know. She straightened her spine. But I'm done running, Mr. Cole. Whatever happens next, at least I'll face it standing still. Outside, the valley waited. And somewhere, men with badges and guns were probably already being dispatched to bring in the fugitive who'd just exposed herself to save a family that wasn't even hers. But tonight, in this moment, Mara Quinn had stopped being afraid. And that, she was learning, made all the difference. They didn't make it out of town before trouble found them. Evelyn saw the men first, 3 of them, wearing tin stars and the kind of cold expressions that suggested they'd been waiting. They stood in front of the livery stable where Garrett had left the wagon, blocking the only exit from town that didn't involve riding through private property or breaking the law in ways too obvious to ignore. Sheriff Fucking stood at the center, his hand resting casual on his gun belt. Flanking him were 2 deputies Evelyn hadn't seen before, bigger men with scarred knuckles and eyes that had stopped caring about right and wrong somewhere around the same time they'd pinned on their badges. Miss Quinn, the sheriff said, his voice carrying across the dusty street. Or should I say, Miss Mara Quinn, fugitive from justice. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. Garrett stepped in front of her, his body a shield. She's done nothing wrong. She's wanted for murder in California. That's a capital crime. And harboring a fugitive is a crime too, Mr. Cole. You want your children to watch you get arrested alongside her? Wade's hand moved toward his belt where the knife was hidden. Evelyn touched his shoulder gently, a warning to stay calm. This was always how it would end, not with legal victories, but with badges and guns, and the kind of authority that didn't care about truth. "I'll go," she said quietly. "No trouble. Just let the Coles leave." "No." Garrett's voice was hard as iron. "You saved my family. I'm not letting them take you. Mr. Cole, you don't have a choice." Actually, he does. The new voice came from behind them, cultured and carrying the weight of real authority. Evelyn turned to see a man stepping out of the town hall, tall and lean, with silver hair and clothes that marked him as someone important. He carried himself with the easy confidence of power that came from position rather than violence. "Governor Ashford," the sheriff stammered, his hand falling away from his gun. "I didn't realize you'd arrived." Clearly, Governor Thomas Ashford looked at the sheriff with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for children caught stealing. "I received a most interesting telegram this morning regarding allegations of fraud and corruption in Copper Creek. Imagine my surprise when I arrived to find law enforcement preparing to arrest the witness rather than the accused. She's a wanted fugitive, allegedly wanted, for a crime that supposedly took place 3 years ago based on a warrant issued by a senator currently under federal investigation." Ashford's voice could have cut glass. A senator whose chief of staff was supposedly murdered but appears to be living quite comfortably in Carson City under the name Robert Matthews. The same senator whose financial dealings with foreign investors are now being reviewed by the Justice Department. The color drained from the sheriff's face. Behind him, Preston Hale had emerged from the bank, flanked by his lawyers, his expression caught between rage and something that might have been fear. Ashford continued, addressing the gathered crowd now. "I've spent the past 4 hours reviewing the documents Miss Quinn provided. Bank records, testimonies, correspondence showing a systematic campaign to defraud the territory and violate federal land laws. The evidence is damning, gentlemen, and it implicates not just Mr. Hale, but several prominent businessmen and at least one sitting sheriff." "This is outrageous," Hale blustered, finding his voice. "This woman is a criminal making wild accusations to save herself. This woman is a legal clerk who uncovered a conspiracy that spans 3 territories and involves millions in illegal land transfers." Ashford turned to face Hale directly. "You've been buying up water rights using shell companies funded by foreign investors, Mr. Hale, companies that have no legal right to own federal land. You've been breaking families, burning barns, cutting fences, all to assemble a development package you intended to sell to the highest bidder in violation of territorial law. You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can. Miss Quinn's documentation is remarkably thorough, as is the testimony of 7 families you systematically destroyed, as are the bank records showing money flowing from San Francisco investors through shell companies registered under false names." Ashford's smile was cold. "You were very careful, Mr. Hale, but not quite careful enough." The crowd was growing now, townspeople drawn by the commotion, all of them watching as their banker, the man who'd held mortgages and futures and fear over them for 3 years, finally faced someone he couldn't buy or intimidate. Hale's lawyer stepped forward, his voice smooth despite the tension. "Governor, surely we can discuss this privately. My client is a respected businessman. Your client is under arrest." Ashford gestured, and 2 territorial marshals appeared from the crowd, men who answered to the governor rather than local authority. "Preston Hale, you're charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States government, illegal acquisition of federal land, extortion, and arson. Take him." The marshals moved forward. Hale backed up, his face purple with rage. "You can't do this. I have connections. You have nothing." Ashford's voice was final. "Your connections were with Senator Morrison, who is currently being indicted. Your investors are foreign nationals who will disappear the moment this becomes public. And your local protection," he glanced at the sheriff, "is about to be removed from office pending investigation." The sheriff made a sound like a wounded animal. One of the deputies started to reach for his gun, then thought better of it when he saw the marshals watching him. The other deputy just looked sick, probably calculating how much trouble he was in for backing the wrong horse. Hale was cuffed and led toward a waiting carriage, still protesting, still threatening, still unable to believe that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. The crowd watched in silence, shock and satisfaction warring on their faces. When Hale was secured in the carriage, Ashford turned to Evelyn. She stood straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones, despite knowing that her own reckoning was still coming. "Miss Quinn, I need you to accompany me to the territorial capital. Your testimony will be crucial to prosecuting not just Hale, but the entire network of corruption you've uncovered." "Am I under arrest?" "No, but you are a material witness in a federal investigation, and—" his expression softened slightly. "I've been in contact with the Justice Department regarding the warrant out of California. They're very interested in your evidence against Senator Morrison, interested enough to offer full immunity in exchange for your cooperation." Evelyn's breath caught. Immunity. Complete pardon for all alleged crimes, protection during the investigation and trial, and a new identity afterward if you want it. Ashford paused. "You've spent 3 years running, Miss Quinn. I'm offering you a chance to stop, to help bring down the men who made you run in the first place, to make your testimony matter." It was everything she'd wanted: safety, vindication, the chance to stop hiding and finally be free. The carpetbag full of evidence she'd carried for 3 years could finally be used for its intended purpose. Morrison and his associates would face justice. Hale's victims would get restitution. All she had to do was leave Copper Creek, leave the Cole family, leave the fight she'd barely started. She looked at Garrett, at Wade standing protective and fierce, at Lila holding Ben's hand while trying to look brave. This family that had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, that had trusted her with their lives when she was still hiding behind a false name. "How long?" she asked Ashford. "How long would I need to be gone?" "Weeks, possibly months. The investigation is complex. Morrison has powerful friends." He studied her carefully. "I know you've formed attachments here, Miss Quinn, but this is bigger than one family. The work you did, the evidence you gathered, it can bring down a conspiracy that's been destroying communities across 3 territories. Isn't that worth the sacrifice?" It was the same argument she'd made to herself 3 years ago, when she'd first discovered Morrison's crimes. The greater good, the larger cause. Individual suffering weighed against systemic justice. She'd chosen to run then, to save herself rather than stand and fight. Had told herself it was survival, that dying for a cause didn't help anyone. But she'd been running ever since, and running hadn't saved anyone at all. "I'll cooperate," she said finally. "I'll testify, provide evidence, do whatever's necessary to bring Morrison down. But first," she turned to Garrett, "I need 24 hours. There's unfinished business here." Ashford frowned. "Miss Quinn." 24 hours, she repeated, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "The hearing reconvenes tomorrow morning. The judge needs to officially dismiss Hale's claims and restore the Cole Ranch's water rights. The families Hale destroyed need to see justice done, not just arrest, but actual resolution. If I disappear now, they'll think it was all for nothing. The case against Hale is solid. The case against Hale proves he's a criminal. It doesn't give these families back what he took: their land, their security, their belief that the law can protect them." Evelyn met his eyes. "I know you want Morrison. I'll give him to you. But first, let me finish what I started here." Ashford studied her for a long moment, weighing politics against principle, expediency against doing things right. Finally, he nodded. 24 hours. But you stay in town where my marshals can keep you safe. Morrison's people might already be on their way." "Understood." The governor departed in his carriage with Hale secured inside, the marshals following close behind. The crowd began to disperse, whispering and exclaiming, already turning today's events into the stories they'd tell for years. The sheriff slunk away, his authority broken, his future uncertain, and Evelyn stood in the dusty street with the Cole family, feeling the weight of what came next settling onto her shoulders. "You're leaving," Wade said. Not a question, an accusation. "I have to testify. It's the only way to make sure Morrison can't hurt anyone else." "But you'll come back." Lila's voice was small, younger than her 10 years. "After the trial, you'll come back, right?" Evelyn wanted to promise that, wanted to tell them she'd return to the ranch, resume her role as housekeeper, be part of this family she'd accidentally claimed. But promises like that were dangerous when dealing with federal investigations and powerful men who killed to protect their secrets. I don't know, she said honestly. The governor offered me a new identity, a fresh start. I might not be able to come back even if I wanted to. So that's it? Wade's voice cracked. You save us and then just disappear? I'm not disappearing. I'm testifying. There's a difference. She looked at Garrett, needing him to understand. This is what I ran from for 3 years, the chance to actually fight back to make Morrison pay for what he did. I can't walk away from that. Garrett's expression was unreadable. I know, but that doesn't make it easier to watch you go. They stood there in the settling dust, this family and the woman who'd stumbled into their lives and changed everything. Evelyn felt the familiar pull of running, of leaving before attachments grew too deep, before goodbye became too hard. But she'd promised 24 hours, and she intended to use them. That night, the Cole family stayed at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. The ranch was too far to travel in darkness, and Ashford's marshals wanted Evelyn where they could guard her. Mrs. Chen fussed over them like they were heroes, serving dinner in her private parlor and refusing payment despite Garrett's protests. You stood up to Hale, she said firmly. That's payment enough. Now eat. The children picked at their food, still processing the day's revelations. Ben kept staring at Evelyn like she might vanish if he looked away. Lila was withdrawn, building walls against the hurt of another loss. Wade was angry, his jaw tight, his eyes accusing. Only Garrett seemed calm, though Evelyn suspected it was the calm of someone too exhausted to feel anything else. After dinner, when the children were finally settled in their rooms, Garrett found Evelyn on the boarding house porch, watching the stars emerge over the valley. They'll be all right, he said, settling into the chair beside her. The kids, they've survived worse than this. Have they? They survived losing their mother, survived watching me nearly lose the ranch. They'll survive you leaving too. His voice was gentle despite the words. We're Cole survivors. It's what we do. Evelyn turned to face him. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to become something they'd have to survive. You're not. You're something they'll remember, something that showed them people can fight back, can stand up to power and win. He paused. You changed us, Mara. Changed how we see ourselves. That doesn't go away just because you do. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the town settle into night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, the sound of music drifted from the saloon where people were probably already celebrating Hale's arrest and speculating about what it meant for the valley's future. What will you do now? Evelyn asked. With the ranch? Rebuild. Pay off the debts Hale's arrest should freeze, buy new hay, repair the barn, get through winter. Garrett smiled slightly. Hire a new housekeeper, probably, though I doubt they'll be half as interesting as you. Well, probably safer, though. Definitely safer. He looked at her, his expression serious. What about you? After the trial, after Morrison's dealt with, what will Mara Quinn do? It was a good question. She'd spent 3 years as Evelyn Hart, hiding and running and surviving. Before that, she'd been Mara Quinn, legal clerk, idealist, someone who believed the law could protect the innocent. But that woman had died the night she'd fled Sacramento. Who would she be now? I don't know, she admitted. The governor offered a new identity, a chance to start over somewhere Morrison's people will never find me. But that feels like just running with official permission. So don't run, testify, help bring them down, then come back here. And do what? Be a housekeeper on a ranch in the middle of nowhere? Why not? Garrett's voice was quiet but steady. You said you were tired of running. This valley could use someone like you. Someone who knows the law, who can help families navigate land claims and water rights and all the legal complications Hale left behind. Someone who's not afraid to fight. Evelyn started to respond, then stopped. It was an appealing image, settling in Copper Creek, using her skills to help rather than hide, building something instead of just surviving. But it was also terrifying in its permanence. Staying meant being found, meant trusting that Morrison's conviction would keep her safe, meant believing she deserved a life beyond fear. Ask me again after the trial, she said finally, when I know if Morrison's really going to pay or if this is just another powerful man walking free while people like me take the fall. I'll ask. Garrett stood, offering his hand to help her up. But I already know your answer. Do you now? You're not the running type, Mara Quinn. Not anymore. You just haven't realized it yet. The hearing reconvened at 10 the next morning with a packed room and tension thick enough to cut. The judge looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, the weight of his near complicity in Hale's schemes visible in every line of his face. He'd been bought, but not completely. Still had enough conscience to feel shame. It was something, at least. With Hale in custody and the territorial governor watching from the back row, the proceedings were mercifully brief. The judge dismissed all claims against the Cole Ranch, restored their water rights with official documentation, and ordered the bank to freeze all foreclosure proceedings pending a full audit of Hale's loans. Then he addressed the other families Hale had destroyed, the Jamesons, the widow Martinez, the Hendersons, all of them watching with desperate hope. The territorial government will be establishing a claims process, the judge said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. Any family that lost property or suffered damages due to Mr. Hale's illegal activities can file for restitution. This won't undo the harm, but it's a start. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was more than they'd had yesterday. When the gavel fell, officially ending the hearing, the room erupted in conversation. People crowded around Garrett, shaking his hand, offering congratulations and apologies for not standing with him sooner. Others approached Evelyn, thanking her with tears in their eyes for having the courage they'd lacked. She accepted their gratitude with grace she didn't quite feel, aware that in a few hours she'd be gone, leaving them to rebuild while she faced her own reckoning. Governor Ashford appeared at her elbow as the crowd thinned. "It's time, Miss Quinn. The capital is 3 days' ride, and I'd like to arrive before Morrison's lawyers can construct too elaborate a defense. I need to say goodbye. Make it quick. My marshals are nervous about keeping you in one place too long." Evelyn found the Cole family outside, gathered by their wagon. The children looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than they had yesterday. Garrett stood behind them, his hand on Wade's shoulder, trying to hold them all together through sheer force of will. She knelt in front of Ben first. "You be good for your father, help with the horses, keep practicing your reading. Will you write to us?" His voice was tiny, barely there. "If I can. But even if you don't hear from me, I'll be thinking about you, all of you." She touched his cheek gently. "You're braver than you know, Ben Cole." Lila was next, her arms crossed, her expression fierce. "You're really leaving?" "I have to." "Everyone always has to." The girl's voice cracked. "Everyone always leaves." Evelyn pulled her into a hug despite Lila's resistance. "I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because staying puts you in danger. Morrison's people might come looking for me. I can't let that happen here, can't risk them hurting your family to get to me." "So you're protecting us?" "I'm trying to." Lila hugged her back suddenly, fiercely. "Come back," she whispered. "Please come back." "I'll try." Wade was last, standing stiff and angry and trying not to cry. "You taught me to fight, taught me that running isn't the only option. And now I'm teaching you that sometimes fighting means knowing when to retreat temporarily." Evelyn met his eyes. "Testifying against Morrison isn't running, Wade. It's standing up to the man who made me flee in the first place. It's finishing what I started 3 years ago." "But you're still leaving us." "Yes, and I'm sorry for that." She pulled out the notebook she'd been keeping, the one with all her observations about the valley, about Copper Creek's politics and Hale's network. "I want you to have this. Everything I learned about how powerful men operate, how they hide corruption, how to fight them using the law. You're smart, Wade. Smart enough to use this information to protect your family and help others. Don't waste it." He took the notebook with trembling hands. "This feels like goodbye. This is goodbye. But goodbye doesn't have to be forever." Finally, she stood before Garrett. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe, or regret, or the complicated combination of both that came from knowing someone briefly but deeply. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything. For fighting when you could have run. For standing with us when you had every reason not to. Thank you for trusting me. For letting me be part of your family, even temporarily." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Take care of them. Take care of yourself. And if you need help navigating the restitution process or dealing with the bank, I'll figure it out. Like I always do. He paused. But I meant what I said last night. If you want to come back when this is over, you'll have a place here. Not as a housekeeper. As family. The word hung between them, weighted with possibility and promise. I'll remember that, Evelyn said softly. Then she turned and walked toward the governor's carriage before her resolve could crack, before the tears threatening to spill could fall, before she could change her mind and choose comfort over justice. The marshals helped her into the carriage. Ashford climbed in beside her, already pulling out papers for her to review. Through the window, she watched the Cole family standing in the street, watched Copper Creek receding as the carriage rolled forward, watched her brief moment of belonging disappear into the distance. You did the right thing, Ashford said, not looking up from his papers. These people needed you to expose Hale. The territory needed Morrison brought to justice. Personal attachments have to come second to that. Evelyn didn't answer. She'd heard similar arguments before, the greater good, the larger cause. Individual happiness sacrificed for collective justice. She'd believed them once. She wasn't sure she believed them now. The ride to the Capitol was long and tense, the marshals watching every tree line and ridge for signs of ambush. Morrison would have heard about Hale's arrest by now, would know that his former clerk had surfaced and was cooperating with authorities, would be scrambling to silence her before she could testify. But Evelyn wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had kept her running for 3 years, had made her small and hidden and safe. But standing up to Hale had reminded her who she used to be, someone who believed the law could protect the innocent if people were brave enough to use it. She'd been that person once. Maybe she could be again. The Capitol was a sprawling town trying desperately to pretend it was a city, all false-fronted buildings and ambitious planning. Ashford installed Evelyn in a hotel under heavy guard and spent the next 3 days preparing her testimony with the federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Reed, who treated the case like a crusade. Morrison's been untouchable for a decade, Reed explained, spreading documents across the hotel room table. We've suspected corruption but never had proof. Your evidence changes everything. The shell companies, the foreign investors, the falsified death certificate. It's enough to build a case that even his political connections can't protect him from. Will he actually go to prison? Evelyn asked. Or will he cut a deal and walk away rich? I can't promise prison. Powerful men have a way of landing on their feet. Reed's expression was hard. But I can promise exposure. His reputation will be destroyed, his political career over, his associates scrambling to distance themselves. That's not nothing. It wasn't everything either. But it was more than Evelyn had dared hope for 3 years ago, when justice seemed like a luxury reserved for people with power and protection. The trial began on a cold November morning, with snow threatening in the steel-gray sky. Senator Morrison sat at the defense table, immaculately dressed, projecting wounded dignity and righteous indignation. His lawyers flanked him like armor, expensive men who'd built careers defending the indefensible. Evelyn took the stand in her emerald dress, the carpetbag's contents now entered as evidence, and told the truth. About discovering the land fraud, about Morrison's threats, about the murder that never happened, and the wanted poster that drove her into hiding. She spoke for 3 hours, methodical and detailed, answering every question Reed posed and weathering the defense's attempts to paint her as a scorned woman seeking revenge. Morrison's lead lawyer tried to make her seem hysterical, unreliable, motivated by grudges rather than justice. But Evelyn had learned something in Copper Creek, had learned that quiet determination could be more powerful than rage. That careful preparation beat emotional appeals, that sometimes the best weapon was simply telling the truth and refusing to be intimidated. When she stepped down from the stand, Reed was smiling. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness corroborated Evelyn's testimony. The supposedly dead chief of staff was located and brought to testify, looking terrified and ashamed. Bank records proved the money trail. Land records showed the fraudulent transfers. By the end, even Morrison's lawyers looked defeated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 14 counts of fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. Morrison's face went gray as the verdict was read, his carefully constructed facade crumbling at last. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to the families his schemes had destroyed. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. but it was something. Evelyn watched from the gallery as Morrison was led away in shackles. This man who'd dominated her nightmares for 3 years, now reduced to just another criminal paying for his crimes. She felt lighter than she had in years. Reed found her after the sentencing, triumph bright in her eyes. "You did it! We couldn't have convicted him without you." "We did it," Evelyn corrected. "Your prosecution was brilliant." "So what now? Ashford mentioned you might want a new identity, relocation to somewhere Morrison's associates can't reach you." Evelyn thought about that offer. Thought about starting over somewhere new with a fresh name and no past. Thought about the freedom that came from being unknown, unconnected, safe. Then she thought about Garrett's quiet strength, Wade's fierce determination, Lila's wounded courage, Ben's innocent faith. Thought about a valley that needed someone who understood the law and wasn't afraid to fight. Thought about the word family and what it might mean to stop running long enough to build one. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to go home." "Home?" "Copper Creek. There's a ranch there. A family. Work that needs doing." Evelyn smiled. "And I promised someone I'd come back and answer a question." Reed studied her carefully. "Are you sure? Morrison had powerful friends. Some of them might hold grudges. Let them. I spent 3 years running from powerful men. I'm done with that." Evelyn's voice was steady. "Besides, I have friends now too. A governor who owes me a favor. A prosecutor who knows how to destroy corrupt officials. And a valley full of people who've learned that sometimes ordinary folks can win against extraordinary power. You're braver than I am." "No, I'm just tired of being afraid." The journey back to Copper Creek took 5 days, longer than necessary because Evelyn kept stopping in towns along the way to send word ahead. To Garrett, telling him she was coming home. To Wade, thanking him for his courage. To Mrs. Chen, asking if the boarding house might need someone with legal skills to help residents navigate land claims and water rights. Each letter felt like laying foundation stones, building something permanent from what had been temporary. Choosing to stay when running would have been easier. When the stage finally rolled into Copper Creek on a bright December morning, Evelyn stepped down into crystalline cold and air that tasted like pine and possibility. The town looked different somehow. Cleaner, maybe, or just less oppressive now that Hale's shadow had lifted. She saw the wagon first, parked outside the mercantile. Then Garrett, emerging from the store with a sack of flour. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and his face transformed, surprise giving way to something warmer, something like joy. He set down the flour and crossed the street, moving with purpose. The children tumbled out of the wagon behind him, Wade tall and serious, Lila trying not to smile, Ben simply beaming. "You came back," Garrett said when he reached her. "I came back." Evelyn met his eyes. "You asked me a question before I left, about what I'd do after the trial." "I remember. The answer is I'd like to stay, if the offer's still open. Not as a housekeeper. Mrs. Chen's offered me work helping families with legal claims. But maybe as—" She hesitated, unsure how to name what they'd become in the brief time she'd known them. "As family," Garrett finished. "The offer's still open, always will be." Wade reached them first, followed by Lila dragging Ben. They surrounded her in a tangle of hugs and questions and the kind of chaotic welcome that meant home. Evelyn felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to hide them. Behind them, the valley spread out in winter beauty, the mountains standing eternal watch over land that had seen too much grief and was ready for healing. The coal ranch was visible in the distance, still struggling but no longer dying, still standing. Like her. Like all of them. "Did you get him?" Wade asked. "Morrison?" 14 counts guilty, 15 years in federal prison. "Good." The simple satisfaction in his voice made her smile. "And Mr. Hale?" Lila asked. "Similar sentence plus restitution payments to everyone he hurt." Evelyn looked at Garrett. "The territorial government established a fund. You should file a claim for the barn, the cattle losses, all of it." "I will. Wade's been keeping records like you taught him." Garrett's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and solid. "Come on, let's go home." Home. The words settled around her like a benediction. They loaded her into the wagon, the same one they'd ridden to the hearing all those weeks ago, though it felt like years, and started the familiar journey to the ranch. As they rode, the children peppered her with questions about the trial, the Capitol, what Morrison had looked like when the verdict was read. She answered patiently, watching the valley unfold around them. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Evelyn saw the changes immediately. A new barn, smaller than the old one but sturdy, stood where the hay barn had burned. The fences had been repaired. The house looked less defeated, as if hope had returned and straightened its sagging shoulders. "We used the first restitution payment to rebuild," Garrett explained. "Nothing fancy but functional. Enough to get through winter and start fresh in spring." "It's perfect," Evelyn said honestly. They pulled into the yard and she climbed down, her boots touching soil that had become familiar during her brief time here. She could see the place where she'd killed the rattlesnake, where she'd run into the burning barn to save the horses, where she'd stood and decided to fight instead of run. Every inch of this place held memories of becoming someone new, or maybe becoming who she'd always been beneath the fear. That night, after supper and stories and the children finally sleeping, Evelyn stood on the porch watching stars emerge in the winter sky. Garrett joined her, 2 cups of coffee warming their hands against the cold. "Thank you," she said, "for holding the offer open, for not giving up on me. Thank you for coming back, for choosing us." He paused. "I know it was a risk. Morrison's people could still come looking. Let them come. I'm done running." She sipped the coffee, tasting chicory and something almost like contentment. "Besides, I've got a territorial governor on my side now, and a valley full of people who know how to fight back against bullies. I like my odds." Garrett laughed quietly. "You're a remarkable woman, Mara Quinn. I'm just someone who got tired of being afraid and decided to do something about it." She turned to face him. "Your family gave me that. Gave me a reason to stand instead of run. I won't forget that." "Neither will we." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the valley settle into night. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly. Closer, the horses moved in their repaired corral, safe and fed and content. Inside the house, 3 children slept secure in the knowledge that their home was theirs again, that the bad man who'd threatened them was gone, that the woman who'd saved them had come back. Evelyn felt peace settling over her like the first snow of winter, gentle, quiet, and impossibly beautiful. She'd spent 3 years running from powerful men who wanted her dead, had hidden behind false names and careful lies, had survived by making herself small and forgettable. But she wasn't small anymore, wasn't forgettable, wasn't running. She was Mara Quinn, legal clerk and former fugitive. She'd brought down a senator and saved a valley. She'd walked through fire and come out stronger, and now, finally, she was home. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, while below them a ranch slowly healed and a family grew by one. Winter would be hard, it always was in the territories. Spring would bring new challenges, but they'd face them together, this widower and his children, and the woman who'd stopped running long enough to discover that sometimes the best place to hide was standing in plain sight, living openly, daring the world to come for her. Let it come. She was ready. She'd been ready all along. She just hadn't known it until a burning barn and 3 grieving children and a man who refused to give up had shown her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to stand anyway. In the distance, Copper Creek's lights glittered against the darkness. A small town in a big territory, full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Surviving, rebuilding, standing together against those who tried to break them. And at the Cole Ranch, on a porch that no longer sagged quite so much, Mara Quinn stood with her coffee and her family and her hard-won peace, and watched the stars and smiled. She was done running. She was finally home.